Mujeres al frente.
Women on the front lines. 70,000 Ukrainian women serve in the armed forces of Ukraine, of whom 5,500 are directly involved in combat. These figures represent a 20% increase compared to the enormous number of monthly deaths in the armed forces of Ukraine, combined with the growing number of desertions, is creating an unprecedented situation. Ukraine will soon have to begin the mass mobilization of women to replace the men who have died. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We begin broadcast number 299, almost 300, of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us and for giving us a thumbs up. Meanwhile there, on the other side of the screen, and the other side of the European continent, from Madrid, Spain, a bit under the weather but always present, Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how are you? Everything all right over there?
Well, here I am with the pharyngitis I usually get around this time of year. It's already a tradition. Just like Christmas, New Year's, and all that, my pharyngitis has become a tradition, and that's why I'm here like this. Now, don't think I'm going off to war or getting ready to rob a bank. No, that's not it, okay? But anyway, the way things are going, it won't be long before we have to do shows like this, so our faces aren't recognized, distorting our voices, because, as I always say, the algorithm is chasing us more and more, and now with artificial intelligence, they're hitting even harder.
That said, before, us too, always with monetized broadcasts and so on and so forth.
Well, before getting into this very interesting matter of recruiting women, I have to share some news. Well, not just important, beyond that, something that will undoubtedly change the course of the war. I mean, up until now, the Russians were winning, and we all thought, myself included, that they were going to win the war. But there are unpredictable events that make one change their mind. And this time it's important because, no less, Lithuania has decided to reinstate mandatory military service, and this will start in 2026. They plan to recruit 5,000 men for next year. Yes, 5,000 men. In other words, the Russians are now redoing all their military plans, because these 5,000 men could reach Moscow in no time. Well, this is the kind of ridiculousness we see from Europeans, and in this case, the Baltics. That is to say, if the Baltics literally think that by doing those silly things, if Russia wanted to, they would, I'm not saying stop, no, not even delay, an invasion or whatever the Russians felt like doing, you'd have to be completely nuts. This shows that these people have serious psychological problems with perceiving reality. But anyway, well, that's the madness of the Europeans. But now, if you want, we can get into this topic because it's an important one. Besides, these kinds of things are always symptomatic in all wars. Let's remember World War II, when the Germans were already recruiting children for the Battle of Berlin. In other words, when you're already recruiting everyone recruitable, children, the elderly, women, extraterrestrials, you name it, it means things are going very badly for you. Extremely badly.
This is a report, by the way, from the Washington Post, Fernando from the Washington Post. Yesterday's column, We won't win this war without women. In this column, they present the figures for mobilized women. 70,000 enlisted, 5,500 on the front lines. And here are images of the first group of combatants made up exclusively of women, all of them drone operators in an independent military unit, with 5 women patrolling near the front to carry out attacks and monitoring operations. Fernando.
Fernando.
Pues aquí dos cosas, al menos. Aparte de lo que
Well, there are at least 2 things here. Apart from what I was saying, when you already have to recruit women, the elderly, and children, it means things are going very badly for you, and you're going to lose no matter what. These are desperate measures that have never, in the history of warfare, managed to turn the tide, so to speak. In other words, it's simply prolonging the agony of the loser, as we saw in World War II with Nazi Germany or in other wars. So as I said, this is a very serious sign. And then on top of that, other reflections should be made. First, notice that we're seeing this new unit, the first one, I think, that has been created of women in charge of operating drones. Well, this reveals 2 things.
Bueno, pues esto revela dos cosas. Una, aunque pueda parecer que no, decir, bueno,
First, even if it might not seem like it, since you operate drones, you're not the one shooting on the front lines. Well, the main target of the Russian troops are the people in charge of operating the drones. So you're actually in the most dangerous position because they'll be looking for you and coming after you. That's the first point. Drone operators right now are the main target for both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians. Second, there's a key factor. Aside from what we've already said countless times about the lack of personnel, which is why they have to recruit women and whoever else they can, this war began with a huge shortage of drones on the Russian side and a clear advantage for the Ukrainians in that area.
Y una superioridad en tema de drones de los ucranianos. Esto ha sido así durante buena parte de la guerra.
This has been the case for much of the war, but it has taken a radical turn this year, in 2025. The Russian superiority right now, both in drone units and in the number of drones, is overwhelming. The fact that they have to resort to training female drone operators shows that they no longer have that superiority in the drone field, which is crucial. What has kept the Ukrainian army from collapsing, especially over the past year, despite the lack of troops, the shortage of people, of personnel to fight, has been that they still had a wall of drones, a certain capacity to more or less hold back the Russians in that area, which is currently key.
Frenar a los rusos en el tema de los drones, que es clave actualmente. Bueno, eso se ha acabado. Eso se ha acabado.
Well, that's over. That's over. And it's becoming evident along all the front lines. Even Ukrainian observers acknowledge it. And this should also lead to other reflections. To what extent are the infamous Europeans, and of course Zelensky's infamous government, willing to follow Boris Johnson's unfortunate maxim of fighting to the last granary? Careful, careful, because on this matter, let's say the most nationalist or ultra-nationalist Ukrainian factions have spoken out, saying that the fight must go on until the end.
Aquí, Fernando, The Wall Street Journal.
Here, Fernando, The Wall Street Journal, no less, hardly something that could be suspected of being pro-Russian, echoing your words, says that Russia is taking the lead in the drone battle, which used to be Ukraine's strong suit. Moscow's army has improved in the use of the most lethal weapons, swarms of small, inexpensive drones. Just to clarify for the critics, drone operators do not take part in combat on the front line itself, but they are physically located in the territories immediately behind the front, in the bordering zones, within a range that, depending on the type of drone and the area, can reach a maximum of 50 kilometers, but is generally much closer, within about 20 kilometers behind, on either side of the contact front. Therefore, they become effective targets for the enemy army, and as Fernando pointed out, they currently represent the main objective of both armed forces, due to the importance drones have taken on, right?
Fíjate, y además hay otro dato, muy difícil de comprobar.
Look, there's another piece of information. It's very hard to verify. These things aren't usually disclosed, but everything points in that direction because it's becoming evident. The Russians, in this matter of drones, as in other areas like tanks and so on, it's becoming clear, especially this year, that they're producing more drones, for example, than they're actually using. And why is that? Well, aside from being able to use them at a given moment for large-scale attacks, everything unfortunately suggests that the Russians know or believe or think that once the war in Ukraine is over, the war with Europe will continue.
Una vez acabada la guerra de Ucrania, la guerra con Europa va a seguir. Ojo, la guerra con Europa no tiene por qué ser militar en sentido estricto.
Careful, the war with Europe doesn't necessarily have to be military in the strict sense, or it doesn't have to immediately enter a military phase. But they have to be prepared for any craziness from the Europeans, and therefore they're creating, let's say, a second army, so to speak, that isn't fighting, but has many more weapons than are currently being used, in anticipation of what might happen after the war in Ukraine. In other words, this already shows where things are heading, no pun intended. Desperate Europeans who want to wage war against the Russians in an absolutely absurd way, and who are dragging us into war. Another thing is whether that war will happen immediately, necessarily. No, but they are deeply involved in it. And it's something existential, increasingly existential for the European political class. Notice how many times we've talked about the issue of corruption within that European political class, inside the European Union, in NATO, in the European part of NATO, that is in different countries that are living, and quite well, at the expense of these European institutions, and that have created a sort of pan-European political class that lives off the taxpayers. And we have the recent case of Mrs. Mogherini. Miss Mogherini, former Foreign Affairs Minister of the European Union, who is now involved in another institution, the usual thing, you retire from one position and they place you somewhere else, has been caught stealing money hand over fist, along with a guy whose name I can't recall, who was Borrell's second in command. Anyway, let's not deny that there are interests at play here. That is, when we now see all the corruption scandals in Ukraine. Part of all that stolen money was indeed taken by Ukrainian leaders, but European leaders also stole part of the money that was given to the Ukrainians. So of course, there are many vested interests in keeping this going, because it's a big business.
And the lack of accounting, Fernando, that obviously corresponds to the promotion of corruption. A percentage for the Ukrainians, of course, but another percentage for the Europeans and for the Americans as well. They themselves can't even determine whether they sent $350 billion or $150 billion. Something in between, more or less.
So every time you hear a figure, each person gives you a different one, because of course they don't know.
The latest on women at the front. Here, images of these women, these very young girls. From left to right, Alexandra, Victoria, Marina, and Daria. Daria, the commander, the first woman in charge of this unit made up exclusively of women. Alexandra, 24 years old, Victoria, 26, and Tetiana, not Tatiana, with, well, in 2022, really very young. Why the participation of these girls? Why their decision, voluntary or not yet massively mandatory? What's your interpretation? Why do these girls end up taking part in this madness?
Let's see. There can be many factors. First, and this is important, there has been indoctrination. Notice that they are very young. That is, if we set the start of the conflict in 2014, these girls were very young back then. From that point on, there has been brutal indoctrination by the respective Ukrainian governments, fostering an exaggerated nationalism and at the same time generating hatred toward Russians. If that's been instilled in you for many years, you end up internalizing it. This could be one of the causes. Then there may be others. There are cases where a husband, boyfriend, brother, or father went to the front, was killed, and somehow out of understandable anger, rage, or desire for revenge, you go. That's also understandable. In other words, there can be many causes, but beyond that, there's also social pressure. It's well regarded to enlist, and it's frowned upon to do nothing. This is especially tough for men, but it's also reaching women.
Esto es especialmente duro para los hombres, pero también está alcanzando a las mujeres. Quiero decir que
I want to say that, Daria, the head of the unit, 35 years old, I would support your analysis, Fernando, with the economic situation of young people. Remember that never before, at least since the mid-20th century, since the beginning of the 30 glorious years of welfare capitalism after World War II, have young people been in such a desperate economic, social, and cultural situation as they are now, without jobs, without prospects for personal, economic, or professional development, without education, increasingly subjected to this mess, unfortunately, in an ever more unequal society, with growing marginalization. And logically, within that framework of despair, incidentally, the same framework from which the revolutions of Generation Z begin, revolutions in the sense of eruptions of fury, without any, with exceptions, such as in the case of Mexico, with a protest organized by the opposition to the government disguised as Generation Z. But in the other eruptions, in the other uprisings led by Generation Z, young people lack organization. They simply react furiously to this utterly disastrous situation. And here indeed, incentives appear for young people through the payment, naturally, of a monthly income to all these youngsters with no prospects.
Ingreso mensual a todos estos jovencitos sin ninguna perspectiva. Si no recuerdo mal, en el caso de Ucrania, de alrededor de entre 1.500.
If I remember correctly, in Ukraine's case, it was around 1,500 to 2,000 euros, which of course, considering people's lives, is very little. But considering the value of that amount of money in Ukraine, for a 22-year-old young woman, it represents a fortune. It's a lot of money. So much that it can set aside any reflection on the possible cost of that money, because it seems like a game to raise it. That other situation also, without a doubt, goes along with everything Fernando said. Two consistent elements.
sin duda alguna, y además, y aquí fíjate la tragedia.
Without a doubt. And also, look at the tragedy, and we've been saying this for a long time. When we say that Ukraine is a failed state and that it has no future as a state, it's not because we like Ukraine more or less, but because we base it on objective data. And this reinforces our arguments in the sense that if many men of reproductive age are already dying, and now a large number of women of reproductive age are also starting to die, you have an insoluble demographic problem. In other words, your country has no future. It has no future because the people who can have children are dying, and those who aren't have left. That is, those who haven't left. And this is a problem that makes Ukraine an unviable state.
Notice that the second one from this unit, Fernando, is in combat. Attention.
Atención. Bueno, celebrando evidentemente algún...
Well, obviously celebrating some kind of military success. But girls, honestly, I can't, beyond the fact that I also want the war to end as soon as possible, and that would only come from a Russian victory, generate hatred within myself toward those young women lost there, used as cannon fodder. To me, they seem like poor girls, victims, even though they serve the evil interests of the Ukrainian political and economic leadership, the European political and economic leadership, and the US political and economic leadership. Those girls, to me, are just poor girls.
Notice that in this regard, things have gotten worse. Let me explain. In World War I, to speak of the first great conflict of the 20th century, mainly on the Western Front, though also on others, the British, French, and Germans had to make massive incorporations of Western women into the workforce. It was a crucial moment for women's entry into the labor market because, as the men were fighting at the front, in a trench line that strongly resembles what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, a line that barely moved and with staggering casualty numbers. I recall that the first Battle of the Somme produced on the first day of the Franco-British attack about 70,000 casualties in a single day. Outrageous. That is, given the critical situation, since there were no men left to work, women joined the workforce. Not because they were feminists or anything like that, since the Europe of that time was hardly feminist, let's be honest, but because that massive incorporation into factories was necessary, producing ammunition, producing cannons in huge quantities. And there are plenty of documents, photos from that time, and so on.
De la época, etcétera. Bueno, pues hemos pasado de meterlas.
Well, we've gone from having them make weapons to sending them directly to the front lines. We've gone backward. That is, this isn't progress, it's regression. Now, it's not just men killing each other, which is bad enough, but we're sending women too. And we're not sending Martians only because they don't exist, but if they did, we would. And this, like in many other things, is a step backward, isn't it? And another thing you mentioned, also very interesting, that I just remembered in relation to what you were saying about the lack of prospects young people have today. And let's not even talk about a young person in Ukraine, in a war situation where you can't do much, is that many young people are aware that in Europe, and especially in Western Europe, but in Europe in general, this will be the first generation to live worse than their parents.
La primera generación que va a vivir peor que sus padres. Es decir, hasta ahora, digamos.
That is to say, until now, let's say, generally speaking, well, it was known that, in general, although there are exceptions, one generation was going to prosper, was going to have better prospects than the previous one after World War II, right? Now we're facing this Generation Z that is very aware it's going to live worse than its parents. And then another interesting thing you mentioned. Look, I've experienced this myself, though to a minimal, microscopic degree compared to other things, but I've lived it and taken part in it. That is to say, look, when there's a protest movement, for whatever reason, and it's legitimate, and moreover it arises from the people themselves, it's quickly instrumentalized. If it's at the local level, within your own country, it's by political parties for their own purposes. If it's at the international level, in this case by the great manipulator that is the United States, for its own purposes, even if the protest arose spontaneously, and let's say, has legitimate demands. It doesn't matter. That quickly gets instrumentalized, and it's very easy to do because I've done it. I mean, when I was involved in politics at the university level and so on, but it's very easy. And political parties right away, and even major states like the United States, which have enormous resources through their organizations, back in the day, USAID or now the NED, etc. Well, this, come on, any small protest in any country, within a few days, we'll have the Americans funding that protest if it suits their interests and turning it to their advantage. That's how it all works.
Fernando, in addition to this, we're going to present many other things in this broadcast. I'd like to begin the next section of our talk today with Putin's words from yesterday, from Moscow. Very, very important ones. We're presenting them here, subtitled by our colleagues from El Ojo.
Compañeros de El Ojo. Atención. Por aquí, ahora sí.
Attention, what I'm saying, more than impossible, Fernando, is your interpretation.
Claro, imposible, Fernando, tu interpretación.
Bueno, hay poco que interpretar, pero vamos, es decir.
Well, there's little to interpret, but anyway, I mean, and I've seen this myself. I mean, I've seen it when talking with military officers, with diplomats in Russia who think like Putin, That is, they see this as something like a semi-civil war among wayward Slavic brothers who have taken the wrong path. And notice that Putin himself makes a gesture like this. He says, no, this is a surgical thing, it's with a scalpel. In other words, this has nothing to do with a real war, like a modern war, he says, like a real war. However, Europe is not Ukraine. Yes, we, he says, have said hundreds of times and so on, that we don't want to go to war with Europe, that we don't want to conquer Europe, that we have no interest whatsoever in a war with Europe.
Que no nos interesa para nada la guerra en Europa. Ahora bien, si los europeos se empeñan, pues estamos...
Now then, if the Europeans insist, we're ready. That is, whenever you want. And that war won't be like the one in Ukraine. There we no longer have those fraternal ties. Let's say no, there we won't show any mercy. This is a warning to sailors and to the European warmongers, to von der Leyen, to Kaja Kallas, to that whole bunch of people who want to drag us into a war against Russia, which would be a disaster. I mean, it would be, let's say, the culmination of the European disaster. Because if there's an inevitable defeat, notice that Putin says, and he's right, he says, no, this war would last very little. It wouldn't last 4 years. We'd settle this, drop 5 or 6 on Kiev, and it'd be over. In other words, it would be the complete collapse of Europe.
Y sería ya el derrumbe completo de Europa. Ahora bien, todo apunta.
Now then, everything suggests that the European political elite is on board. Not on board to confront things directly, because they're cowards, they don't have that courage, but rather to do everything possible to use proxies, as in the case of Ukraine, possibly Moldova in the future, or to create tense situations, or in a context of hybrid warfare or cyber warfare, to attack ships. Using, for example, and this is something that could happen, once the war is won, the collapse of Ukraine will generate a fairly large number of Ukrainian nationalists willing to be instrumentalized to cause problems. Terrorist attacks, assaults, as I've seen now, on transport ships, and to maintain a state of permanent tension.
Mantener una tensión permanentemente.
Putin made these statements yesterday at a press conference held during the Russia Calling Forum, an economic and investment forum. By the way, he made them in response to a question, not as something prepared in advance, but asked by journalists. Putin answers questions from both pro-Russian and anti-Russian journalists, unlike Western politicians. And when asked, "Do you want an attack on Europe?" he replied, "No, but if they start, I don't want to fight, but if you do, then no surgical operations." Then also, here's another little piece. This is a fragment from before the Turkey issue, Fernando, but it's in English, and I wanted the translation because there are a couple of very interesting things said in the same context. Attention. First this. Well, like that, the English subtitles.
Esto, bueno, así, los subtítulos en inglés.
The Europeans had the thesis of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, and they still live under that illusion.
A pesar de que en sus cabezas se dan cuenta de que esto ya no puede ser más.
Even though deep down they realize that things can't go on like this, they still cling to the idea of a strategic defeat against Russia and can't admit it to themselves. That notion of a strategic defeat is now impossible. First, because we stepped aside. We, the Russians. The Europeans today, seeing that they weren't satisfied with how the negotiations were progressing. He said this yesterday, just minutes before the meeting with Vitkov, hence the reference.
The United States administration.
Disappointed by the negotiations we are conducting with the Americans, they have already begun to put up every possible obstacle to Trump's attempts to achieve peace through negotiations. On one hand, they refuse to take part in peace talks, and on the other, they block President Trump's efforts. Thirdly, they have no peace agenda.
Tercero, no tienen una agenda de paz.
They are on the side of war.
Y aunque supuestamente están tratando de hacer...
And although they are supposedly trying to make changes to Trump's proposal, we can clearly see that those changes are aimed at one thing only: the Europeans' desire to block the end of the war. And that's why they promote demands that are completely unacceptable to Russia, and then blame Russia for supposedly boycotting the peace process.
De supuestamente boicotear el proceso de paz. Vemos esta situación claramente.
We see this situation clearly.
Por eso, si quieren volver a la realidad...
That's why, if they want to return to reality based on what's happening on Earth, well, welcome. Let them come back to reality. Well, the words are quite clear once again.
Las palabras nuevamente de
Porque esto, lo grave de esto es esta esquizofrenia que no se entiende de los europeos.
The serious thing about this is the schizophrenia that Europeans have, which makes no sense, because indeed, as Putin points out, maybe the top brass still believe they can beat the Russians and all that, but all of them know perfectly well that this war is lost, even if they say otherwise and so on. And this was confirmed in a statement, I don't know if I heard it yesterday, by the Belgian Prime Minister, Alexander De Croo, mispronounced as always. Since the European Union is pressuring the Belgians to have the frozen Russian assets in Europe, which are mainly in Belgium, directly stolen and transferred to the Ukrainians, of course, the guy is defending himself, because that would be an absolute disaster for Belgium.
Porque eso sería un desastre para Bélgica absoluto. Y dice lo siguiente, fíjate lo que nos cuenta.
And it says the following. Look at what the Belgian Prime Minister tells us. The report states that Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo declared that no one within the European Union seriously considers the defeat of Russia in the conflict with Ukraine. Everyone knows that's not going to happen. He described such expectations as fairy tales and empty illusions. The reason was the question of whether Russian assets could go to Ukraine. De Croo recalled that in the past, the sovereign assets of other countries were only frozen during conflicts, frozen, not transferred, which is not the same, he said, and that they could only be transferred to the other side after a clear defeat. In the current situation, such an outcome, the defeat of Russia, is considered almost impossible. He also emphasized that the direct transfer of frozen assets to another country has never been done, and seems more like an attempt to confiscate them than anything else. In other words, he's defending himself as best he can, because he knows this would mean the downfall of Belgium, of the European Union if it goes through, since trust would completely disappear, and no one, absolutely no one, would invest money here anymore. But notice how he admits it, in this case, standing up to the European Union, saying no. But come on, let's not be ridiculous. We know this is lost, that Russia has won, that you know it, I know it. It's another matter that we have to keep up appearances because there are interests, and so on. Fine, but... Well, here Putin is saying it very clearly, that is to say, well, and notice also, and we'll talk about this now, the alignment between Trump's and Putin's speeches.
Entre los discursos de Trump y de Putin. Fíjate que al final los dos confluyen en que la...
Notice that in the end, both of them agree that the Europeans are to blame. That is for different reasons. This is already taking shape. The Ukrainians, who we know are going to fall, and the foolish Europeans who are going to pay for the deal because we've already agreed on who the villains of the story are. The villains in this story are going to be the Biden administration who started the war, and the Europeans, of course. Ferenczi and company are getting hit by 2 newspapers. In fact, I've already seen statements from European Parliament members, from the Rada, Ukrainian deputies, saying, you never know if it's true or not that Zelensky will resign before the end of the year. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what they're saying. They're saying it wide awake.
Here are some images of the Ukrainian Rada.
Yes, it's not exactly a haven of peace. A haven of peace it is not.
Pero antes quería redondear las palabras de Putin porque...
But first, I wanted to expand on Putin's words, because he also presented his perspective on the situation in the Black Sea, where in the context of Ukrainian and European desperation, the Ukrainians took part, according to the most serious military analysts, British and German above all. Anyway, the Ukrainians appear directly involved, and they carried out 2 attacks against tanker ships, as they're called, those fuel transport vessels, mainly for oil and gas, in the Black Sea, off the coast of Turkey. They were empty, without cargo at the time, but still, one was almost certainly sunk. The other...
Pero aún así, uno seguramente hundido, el otro de destino desconocido, pero bueno.
Of unknown destination. But anyway, they attacked these civilian ships out of desperation. And these are Putin's words on the matter. Thanks for watching the video. This is very serious, loaded in this press conference, full of Putin talk.
She let her hair down, so to speak. Look, this is very serious, and notice Putin's extreme restraint. But even so, let's see, attacking our ships in the Black Sea and all that. And they even bragged about it, because the Ukrainians even posted footage showing how they got there. Now they're backtracking, huh? After Putin said this, they came out saying, no, it wasn't us, it was others. And things like that, of course. And Putin says 3 things. First, that now, for sure, they're going to increase attacks on port infrastructure and on the ships that are constantly sending weapons and other things to Ukraine. There we have it. I mean, they even recorded it and everything.
The video they themselves released, right?
I mean, it's just that you can see the impact, the explosion, and luckily they were empty. Because then, let's say, the one you see burning and all that, even in the sea, isn't the ship's oil, you know, the one carrying the gas. It's the fuel that powers the ship itself.
The ship's own fuel, indeed.
Now, it really is quite big. And here, look, they go straight toward where the propellers are.
The back part, yes.
The rear part, that is. So, of course, then they attacked a third one later, which was carrying, I think, sunflower oil or something like that. That is, this one wasn't attacked with maritime drones. It was attacked with an aerial drone. So, of course, Putin says, we're going to do this now, insists, and adds, now then, the next step, I'm not saying we're going to do it, but it's not out of the question, is to attack ships from other countries that are helping the Ukrainians. Meaning the Europeans. Watch out for the nonsense. We're taking the Russians and Putin as a joke, and one day we're going to find ourselves running straight into that famous red line, for real. In other words, let's say, in trouble. And we've messed it up. And the third one is already the most serious. And it says, well, no, here, directly, if they get too stubborn, we'll cut off Ukraine's maritime access to the Black Sea, because we're going to destroy all their port infrastructure, and any ship that comes in won't be loaded. And we'll do this in 2 days. That is to say, well, we keep playing, well, the Europeans keep playing, at provocations, especially the British, at escalation. Well, one day we're going to find out that the Russians have said that's as far as we go. And then what do? Mr. Macron, Mr. Merz, Mr. Steimer, let's see what you do when the Russians get tired.
We, Fernando, don't want any kind of escalation, except for the escalation of likes.
This one is extremely important.
This escalation, 2,000 viewers connected, and barely 900 likes. Please, likes. That helps us fight censorship in these times of a new wave of demonetization and censorship. Luckily, so far we've only been affected in a few videos. Other channels, much more. I'm not going to say which ones, of course, but, well, the ones you all know.
Pero bueno, de los conocidos por todos ustedes.
Pero bueno,
por cierto,
quería aprovechar. No, sigue, ahora te lo digo.
Un pedido más a los demoledores, recuerden que...
One more request to the demolishers. Remember that about 2 weeks ago, we reactivated the TikTok account, the Demoliendo Mitos TikTok channel. We still have very few followers there. Please, to all the demolishers on TikTok, join us there. We're posting very good short videos. Subscribing there is free as well. That's the request. And on our English channel, of course. The link is in the description. Demoliendo Mitos, in English. Demolishing Political Myths is the English name. Fernando, yes.
Fernando,
no,
sí.
quería hacerte, además tú lo conoces mejor que yo, una breve referencia.
I wanted to make, and you know this better than I do, a brief comment. The freedom of expression we have in the West, in Europe, is so vast. How out of control freedom of expression has become. You can say anything. And just recently, a few days ago, and as I said, you know this better since you're in Germany, the leader, her last name is unpronounceable for me, the leader of the left, Wagenknecht, was being interviewed, and they cut her off just like that, completely. Just like that, right? You tell it, since you know it better.
De una, ¿no? Cuéntalo tú que lo conoces mejor.
Bueno, pero Fernando, acá en Alemania, la libertad de
No, well,
expresión
but,
solamente...
Fernando, here in Germany, freedom of speech is just a phrase. To give my own example, just for taking a position in favor of peace and negotiation in NATO's war against Russia, I was kicked out of the German public media, specifically from Deutsche Welle, and expelled from the university. And I'm a nobody, a minor figure. People much more important than me to the Germans. Like Sarah, yes, for example, a political leader like Sarah Wagenknecht. Many German academics, even the philosopher Habermas himself, one of the key figures of 20th century German philosophy, all of them directly and completely censored, silenced, and condemned to ostracism. That's how simple it is, the freedom and the...
Freedom of speech, of discourse, of opinion. All lies. Lies out of sheer brazenness. I mean, come on, you're talking and they cut you off just like that, brutally, leaving you hanging mid-sentence. I don't know, maybe do something. No, whatever. It doesn't matter anymore. I mean, that's exactly why I was saying it. Because of the brazenness, right? And to a political leader, I mean, someone well-known, very well-known in Germany and all that, it's not like you can say, well, they cut off some guy or some woman nobody knows.
Remember that fraud was committed against that lady in the last elections. Ah, yes. Let's recall that the German constitution sets a 5% threshold for entering parliament. And officially her new party almost won seats in the German parliament, despite having been created only 6 months earlier. That would have been something unprecedented in German politics. Very conservative, very slow. A newly created party almost managed to enter parliament, but why couldn't it? Because of that 5% threshold, they officially recorded 4.98%. They know, from their own counts, that in reality they were above that. And the Supreme Court of Justice in Germany, the Electoral Tribunal, ruled that, by the way, just like in Venezuela, they should hand over the records, show the records. Well, here no record was shown. They rejected the recount, and the one who ultimately made the final decision, after all this, was the German parliament itself, elected in that fraudulent election, with representatives who got in thanks to the theft of seats from that lady's party. They themselves took part in the vote, rejecting the recount. Of course, they wouldn't want to give up their seats, obviously. Well, that's the truth about Germany.
A very democratic procedure, I mean. It's laughable. If it weren't for anything else, it would be comical. But anyway, what you were pointing out...
But then, man, oh man.
We missed the Sultan Erdogan.
Angry. And I would remind the Sultan. I would help him remember. My friend Sultan, you, at the time in the beginning, helped Ukraine with the Bayraktar drones.
Now he's angry, but anyway, here are his words.
Well, angry about the attack on the Turkish coast, and, apparently, about the ownership of one of the Turkish ships, though part of the Russian Ghost Fleet, one of the ships apparently owned by Turkey. Now, our friend Erdogan is angry, and my dear, you had one foot on one side and the other on the other. What are the consequences?
Claro, esto de estar jugando en todas las mesas, es decir...
Of course, this thing about playing at every table, I mean... Well, now it's like, okay, no, this is terrible, this is awful, it's really bad. But to me, Erdogan, what are you willing to do? Because then, of course, you end up doing nothing. I mean, they've attacked 2 ships in your waters, well, in your exclusive economic zone, meaning it was Turkish territory. You should do something, I'd say. I don't know, beyond just saying how bad everyone is and how terrible this all is, and that we can't go on like this. And it really reminds me of his anti-Israel stance, which in practice translated into oil and gas support for Israel. Well, we already know that Erdogan plays at every table, on every front, and makes deals with some and others depending on his interests. And he can get along perfectly well with the Russians for certain things, with the Americans for others, and play both sides, supporting the Russians and at the same time the Ukrainians. It's something that has to be acknowledged. Erdogan knows how to handle it very well. He knows how to play the game in general. Sometimes it goes wrong for him, but still. Erdogan is a very good example because this is the reality of politics. Erdogan does it, let's say, in a very obvious way, others not so much. But let's not fool ourselves. 2 countries can be at war, hate each other to death and all that, as happened during the Cold War. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States represented completely opposite things.
Y Estados Unidos representaban cosas completamente opuestas. El capitalismo frente al comunismo. Es decir, modelos antagónicos.
Capitalism versus communism. That is, antagonistic and mutually exclusive models. But when it suited them to cooperate, they did. I mean, one thing doesn't cancel out the other. This is all about interests, nothing more. So, well, it's the same with the Chinese. The Chinese are strongly supporting Russia. In fact, while, or a bit before, on the same day that Viktor was there, he arrived with Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and this Dmitriev guy, it seems, took him on a sightseeing tour of Red Square, even though it was a bit cold and all that. Anyway, Lavrov met with the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi. So while you're talking to one, you're also talking to the other. And the Chinese and the Russians are very clear that they have common interests. That is, which doesn't mean that, and I'll give an example because this one is well known. That is to say, and that's where the weakness of the United States lies. They say, no, but what about the drones and all that? Well, the Chinese, have they supported Russia with the drone issue? Yes. Have they sold them dual-use drones? Yes, plenty. Drone components? Yes, including engines. But they also sold them to the Ukrainians, until not too long ago. And not only to the Ukrainians, but also to the Americans. One of the problems the United States has is that most of its military drones use Chinese components. In other words, the Chinese aren't stupid. They know the Americans are their enemy, in the sense that they're coming after them. But it's also a way to keep them pleased. Well, I'll stop selling components and let's see how you make your drones. So, here we see the entourage.
Here are the images of Viktor and Kushner's motorcade from yesterday, arriving at the Kremlin. And here are the few images available. The Kremlin is always so imposing. These are the few images that were released.
Very interesting, huh? What we're seeing here, we'll talk about it in a moment. Look at the people. It's understood that this lady here and this younger one in the middle are translators, or rather interpreters. And who do we have here? Viktor, Jared Kushner, on this side. On the other side, we have Dmitriev, the translator, Putin, and Ushakov. And this is no coincidence. Let me explain why it's not a coincidence. The Russians are very formal about these things. Also, let's not forget that the current Russian state, when the Soviet Union disappeared during Yeltsin's time, was built largely in the image and likeness of the United States, a presidential system, and so on. Who is Viktor? Aside from being an old friend of Trump, he's the special envoy appointed by the president for these Ukraine-related matters, for the Russian side, because let's not forget that until recently Kellogg was handling the Ukrainian side. So he's the president's envoy, not part of the government, let's say. He's not Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State, the foreign minister, so to speak. And who does Putin meet with him? There's no government official present. Among those there, Ushakov, a special advisor, Dmitriev, another one, well, the head of the international investment funds and so on. But no one connected to the government. In other words, they're talking informally between presidential administrations. At that point, they've spent 5 hours talking, which means they've had plenty of time to talk, really. Let's imagine they reached a more or less solid agreement. This would move on to the next stage, which would be at the government level. Marco Rubio, as a representative of the State Department, or as the head of the State Department, would meet with Lavrov as the foreign minister. And that's already formal. It's no longer a matter of sending a special envoy who happens to be a buddy of mine to tell you a bit about what I think. No. So watch out, these things all have their value. I mean, on top of that, the Russians place a lot of value on these things. The Americans less so, but they're very formal and project the image they project. I mean, because, well, from what little we know about this meeting, since there wasn't even an official statement, just a brief comment that didn't say much, to be honest. One of the interesting things mentioned was that they discussed, without going into details or those famous 28 points or anything like that, the core issues. We already know what we're talking about. Those well-known points that Putin made perfectly clear on June 14th of last year, 2024, and on which the Russians haven't budged an inch. And what I think they're doing right now is basically aligning their positions. Because look, the pressure on Ukraine here is tremendous. From a military point of view, the Russians are hitting them hard. From a political point of view, the Americans are pressing with the corruption issue. Double pressure. Why? Because both Trump and Putin, as I said, for completely different reasons, are after the same thing, getting rid of the Ukraine problem. One side through defeat, and Trump doesn't care at all, but he wants to get that problem off his back. And in fact, I believe I've been saying it from the beginning, since the talks started between the Russians, from the Trump administration, and Putin, that basically they share the same interests. Another thing Sarkov said, and they always repeat this if you remember, every time there's been a meeting between Putin and Trump, between the Russians, whoever it is, Lavrov, Marco Rubio, whoever, they always say the same thing. And this isn't by chance. We haven't talked about this thing, that thing, or the other, or about economic relations, how to relaunch those economic relations that have been interrupted. It's no coincidence that they keep telling you this over and over. And both sides say it, you know? That is, let's not forget that for Trump, it's essential to relaunch those economic relations for several reasons, but mainly, aside from the famous rare earths, because of oil and gas. And I'm going to give you some data that I think is very revealing. Look, and now I do this. This is a twist, like in good movies, right? Like those movies that start one way and suddenly take a turn. And you go, what's this? Why is this guy telling me this? Like,
Dmitriev's participation there, obviously, comes with an economic message.
Claro, claro, claro.
100%.
Sure, 100%, 100%. I mean, look, I'm saying this because in the end, when you dig deeper, you almost always find the same thing. Oil, gas, energy, strategic minerals. Then there may be many more reasons for the conflict, for whatever. And look, we're going to make a turn, but we'll end up back in Russia again. That is to say, and let me clarify this well, the United States has approximately 5 to 7 years left of conventional oil. Not shale oil. Conventional oil meaning the kind Saudi Arabia has, the kind Iraq has, the kind Iran has, the kind Russia has, the kind we've always known, so we understand each other.
De toda la vida, para que nos entendamos. Si dependiera únicamente de sus reservas.
If it depended solely on its proven conventional reserves, that is, the United States has between 5 and 7 years of conventional oil left, the good quality kind, the traditional one, if we only take proven reserves into account. If they find more tomorrow, that's a different story, because exploration is possible. The Americans know this perfectly well. Moreover, the United States currently holds the world's largest reserves of shale oil, the lower quality kind, the one obtained through hydraulic fracturing, through fracking. But they also know it, because they have to roughly calculate what it means that in addition to those 5 or 7 years of proven conventional oil reserves, they have another 10 or 15 years, let's say, of extended shale oil. And that's it. Therefore, the United States knows perfectly well, and Trump knows it, that, let's say, by 2040, they'll have no oil. And let's not forget that the United States accounts for about a quarter of the world's oil consumption. In other words, they consume a lot. That is to say, then, the United States, and now we turn back to Russia. Well, this is one of the reasons why it attacks Venezuela. That is, the ones that are needed. Let's not forget that in addition, Venezuela has heavy crude oil, and most American refineries are designed for Venezuelan heavy crude or equivalents. And now we come back to Russia. We have what we have. That is, right now there are no surpluses of oil or gas, and so on. They know that in a few years they're going to have to. They are oil importers, but they'll even have to become gas importers. Right now they're gas exporters. And who can sell it to them? Well, a country called Russia.
That's how clear it is. With your analysis, Fernando, not in 40 years, but as soon as next year, China currently holds 90% of the world's rare earth processing capacity, between 70 and 80% of ownership, and 90% of processing. What alternative does the United States have? Above all, Russia appears as the option. Just for reference, an F-35 contains around 400 to 500 kilos of rare earths in its structure. A Victoria-class submarine, a US nuclear submarine, has around 5,000 kilos of rare earths among its materials. That's why Trump was so desperate at the time, when he started with his bluster.
This gadget we have here, a cell phone, if I remember correctly, contains between 30 and 40 different types of rare earths and strategic critical minerals. That's it. And let's see what happens. You end up without cell phones, without computers, without anything.
Without the automotive industry, above all because of the use of rare earths for the manufacture of magnets, which are essential in electronics. Trump started with the bravado of tariffs. The Chinese responded with tariffs. Then he decided to impose bans on certain products, on the shipment of next-generation chips. And the Chinese replied, well, if that's how it is, then we'll stop sending rare earths. 2 days later, Trump was on the red phone, not the Russian red one, his own emergency red phone, because all the American industrialists called him, and above all, those from the military-industrial sector, the most important for his administration. Without materials from our Chinese friends, we can't even make a nut.
Y entonces Trump debió rectificar.
And so Trump had to backtrack. And what is the only possible way out of this, considering that, while the United States is currently engaged in an almost direct confrontation with Russia through Ukraine, as part of a strategic challenge, as they call it, as a long-term rival, yes, a rival in the struggle for global hegemony, Russia does not appear in that role. Russia would represent a potential ally, but as a potential opponent in the fight for global dominance, China emerges instead. That's why there's an effort to reach these economic agreements with Russia as soon as possible. And that's why this meeting with the industrial leaders on both sides of each business.
Con los popes industriales a cada lado de cada uno de los negocios.
Claro, es que justo en ese sentido que tú dices.
Right. It's exactly in that sense you're talking about. When you go over the list, okay, we see that the Chinese are the main producers and processors of rare earths, practically holding a monopoly. But then you ask yourself, well, who comes next? If I remember correctly, Vietnam. Well, it's not very pro-American, nor very pro-Chinese either, but since it doesn't have processing capacity, it has to send its rare earths to China to be processed. Governments have ruled it out. Who else is among the top 4 or 5? Well, there's one that is. In fact, they've already signed an agreement. The Australians, who from a mining standpoint have almost everything. Okay, that's true. But who else is there? Because the Australians alone aren't enough. Well, there's also Brazil. In Brazil, things are not very clear. And who else has rare earths? Russia. They definitely do. So, in other words, in the end, I have some economic interests in what's key, in what really matters right now. Oil, gas, strategic minerals like rare earths, of which Russia has a lot and which I'm going to need. So I'm interested in resolving the issue of Ukraine. And that's why Trump doesn't care at all about Ukraine. Let the Europeans deal with it. Let them do whatever they want. But I have to reconcile with the Russians, not because I'm fond of them, but because I have no other choice. And that's why all his policies, generally quite unplanned, absolutely reckless, with no real criteria, suddenly he goes after Venezuela. He goes after Venezuela because he wants its oil, nothing else. And you start to see that everyone he picks a fight with, he doesn't pick a fight with Andorra. Why doesn't he pick a fight with Andorra? Because it has nothing. No strategic minerals, no oil, nothing. So what's at stake here? Well, there you have it, rare earths.
There's the chart. By the way, Australia does indeed have enormous mining potential and huge production, but besides being terribly polluting, it's also extremely energy intensive, for example. Australian lithium. Australia produces a very large share of the lithium consumed today, but at a much higher cost than lithium from, say, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, due to natural factors. Lithium that can simply be extracted from salt flats, left in the sun to dry, and from there, the lithium salt is obtained. Australians can't do that. They carry out an excavation in a mine and then have to go through a process to dissolve all the minerals. Well, all of that generates an energy consumption and a cost for that lithium that's tremendously higher than, for example, in Argentina, Bolivia or Chile, or in other parts of the world. Well, the same goes for other strategic minerals. Australia has many reserves, but at a very high cost.
This really makes me laugh, because people sometimes say about many European countries, no, we also have rare earths and other things here. Yes, but look, there's a key factor, which is concentration. Sure, rare earths exist all over the world. The issue is concentration. In other words, what we commonly call a mining deposit of anything, whether coal or rare earths, is a place where there's a high concentration of that mineral or element, which allows you to extract it profitably. Because elements, meaning those from the periodic table, are scattered all over the world.
The same as the oil sands in Canada. Sure, there's a lot of oil, an enormous amount, but it's mixed with sand. That's why, with the barrel below, if I remember correctly, $80, it becomes unfeasible because of the energy required to extract that oil from the sand. 418 kilos for an F-35, 2,600 kilos for a Burke-class destroyer, and 4,600 kilos for a Virginia-class submarine. Elements like neodymium or praseodymium. What names these elements have? Really strange ones, right?
Qué nombrecitos estos elementos. Bueno, realmente raros, ¿no? Realmente raros.
Bueno, no son tan... A ver, los nombres sí son raros.
Let's see. The names are indeed strange. Actually, most of them aren't rare because there's little of them. They're not rare for that reason. What happens is that they're concentrated in very few countries. That is, exploitable deposits, those that are profitable and not outrageously expensive to extract, exist in very few places. But as I said, there are rarer things. Gold, for instance. Gold, which is something we all know. Well, about 3,000 and something. Maybe 4,000 tons of gold are extracted worldwide every year. That's nothing. I mean, compare that to the amount of iron that's extracted. I don't know how much, but it's an enormous amount. I mean, look, an analyst you and I both know, who appears on a TV show, I once heard him say the following nonsense. My goodness. Well, I don't know why gold is so important and all that. People buy gold and stuff, but it's only good for jewelry. My God, what ignorance. Gold is essential for a lot of industrial processes, in small amounts, of course. But gold here. Yes, there's gold in computers, in cars, there's gold too. I mean, watch out. That idea that gold is only good for jewelry, no, not at all. And besides, they're vital. In some cases, they can be replaced by silver, in others not. I mean, of course, these things that, well, these somewhat comical commentators say, like, well, no, gold is essential for many things, obviously in minimal quantities, but the first letter of the name, Fernando, of that commentator, let's see, it has to do with what you do when you get up in the morning to go to work. You get up, and I won't say more. What do? It starts with T. I won't say more or I'll mess it up. Early, you get up early. You get up early. With T, idiot. No, not idiot. Early.
Tarado.
No, tarado no, temprano.
Asleep.
No, he gets up early.
But it's the last name.
The last name.
He gets up early. Now yes, they're there, but well, speaking of, yes.
Speaking of something, well, here we see a normal parliamentary session of the Ghanaian parliament, which is common in these rounds.
Yesterday, the head of the Rada, the Ukrainian Rada, and quite a few Ukrainian deputies with banners shouting, "Resign, resign, resign," obviously referring to Zelensky. The political situation in Ukraine is heated, very heated. Let's take a quick look at the front, Fernando. Let's go to the front. We're going to present quite a few interesting things about Venezuela, but maybe to wrap up. By the way, here are images distributed by Russian television, already from Pokrov, from inside Pokrov. Yes.
This is the building. I don't remember which one. Something, let's say, related to food, something like that. One of those official places. And they've also put up flags in several parts of Pokrov. I mean, it's not like, well, we get to a street, take a picture here, and leave. No, there was, I don't quite remember now, but there was an attempt at manipulation by the Ukrainians with these photos to make it look like it was the Ukrainians using artificial intelligence and so on, who were raising the flag, changing the flag, and all that. But anyway, well, Pokrov isn't very destroyed, at least compared to what you can see in other cities. Like, and now if we're going to talk about it, like Volchansk, which is already completely conquered. I mean, you go see Volchansk and it's a mess. I mean, well, yes, there are buildings that have burned and all that, but of course, even though it's war, this shows a change in tactics. That is, it's no longer about pounding a city and leaving it in ruins. and then the speed with which the final phase of the operation in Pokrov was carried out. I mean, even though the encirclement, taking positions, nearby villages, and all that took some time, once they entered Pokrov, it was relatively quick, just a few months.
Over here, Ukraine, many advances once again. In the south, a lot. Uliapole is already being fought over, yes, with parts of Uliapole already taken. Fernando, what can we say about, well, there are bombings here. What can we present about this situation in the south? Any news? Anything not mentioned so far? Have they taken another village?
Basically, they keep advancing. Uliapole, indeed, right now, the Russians, I'm looking at the very latest updates, they've already taken a part in the south, small, but a part nonetheless. You can already see quite a few streets, and then they've entered from, let's see, roughly the northeast, and there they've taken several positions. And well, let's not forget that the important thing is that the remaining gaps in between have been shrinking. So, for example, Drohobych has fallen. Let's see, Drohobych, there are a lot of them too, but anyway, if you follow the road, I never remember the name of the river that runs alongside it. Well, the Russians have already taken up there, right? Up there, Drohobych. Well, they've taken over, if you look, this whole line. If they keep going along the road, it means they practically have everything already. We keep going down. Now they're getting closer. They're practically fighting in a village called Barabariska, probably mispronounced. That's just below Drohobych. And once they finish with that, well, you know, there's not much left. I mean, all they have to do is cross the river. I can never remember its name. Wait, Jaichur or something like that. Hold on, I'll tell you in a second.
The river called Jaichur, or something like that. I don't quite remember the name. But yes, that's the one they have to cross now.
Jaichur, mispronounced. Something like that. Well, they've already crossed it at some point. Crossing the river and encircling, that's how I'd put it. If you look closely, they're doing what they always do. That is, they keep encircling and encircling. Once they've crossed the river and finished attacking these last remaining parts, indeed, as Ezekiel Bistoletti points out very well, they finish taking this small remaining area here, cross the river, and then we've got it surrounded. And watch out, this is important. 2 developments along this front line. Quite significant, because this is really worrying them. And there's a lot of criticism coming from within the Ukrainian regime. Generals, deputies, and so on. The thing is, Orehov, which had been relatively quiet for quite some time, has made an advance that's not very large, but still substantial, here in Novodanilivka, more or less. They've entered the southern part of the city, but of course notice that Novodanilivka is right next to Orikhiv. It's basically a stone's throw away. The moment they finish taking the city, careful, because they're starting to come in from Tomachevka or something like that, or Tonachavka. I'm terrible with these names. Tokmashka, apparently. Tokmashka. Yes, that's it. Well, they're here, but now they've opened a new line over here. Careful, because it's already being said in Ukraine that Huliaipole is going to fall, that it's indefensible. And the next one is Orikhiv. But if we move toward the Dnipro, there's been a significant advance, not so much in terms of land gained, but because they've crossed a difficult area. In a place called, it's about the Dnipro, right? This one, Ponyativka, or something like that. I mean, well, this place was resisting, but it's practically taken now. They've surrounded the town, and from now on, the Ukrainians have pulled back, because they've already lost this position, to the next line of defense, which will be farther north, in a place called something like Girozhivka, farther north. In other words, watch out, this has practically fallen already. The advance continues and is slowly approaching Zaporizhia, the capital. In fact, there are already Ukrainian commentators from Ukraine, but Ukrainians, who are almost considering Zaporizhzhia lost. And note, the entire region's still in their hands, plus a good part of Dnipropetrovsk, because this remains a disaster from the point of view of the Ukrainian troops.
The major negotiations, the masterful European negotiations, will determine that even if Zaporizhzhia is taken by the Russians will abandon it, dear Fernando.
Of course, yes, man. They're going to abandon him. And moreover, as that, I was going to say something awful. I was going to call her mentally retarded, but no, I won't say that. The fool from Kahakala says, no, but what the Russians have to do is disarm and... What was the other nonsense she said? Disarm and set a limit on their troops. A limit on their troops and disarm.
The thing about the attacks against 19 neighboring countries.
Ah, yes, well, of course it doesn't. Right now, Russia has 14 neighboring countries. What is he going to talk about?
To everybody, and I'm not talking about European countries, but all the neighboring countries.
Here you go.
Those 19 countries that they have invaded in last 100 years.
If Kallas is referring to 19 neighboring countries, it's a bit hard to believe that Russia could have invaded them, considering it only shares borders with 16, and that's including maritime borders. Even if we counted the entire USSR, it would still be impossible, since it only shared borders with 18. But if Kallas is talking about 19 bordering countries in general, it doesn't inspire much confidence that he can't even name which ones they were.
Well, 19, not 25. In the last 100 years, for me, let's see. In the last 100 years, the numbers don't add up for me. Unless we start making small, let's say, historical adjustments, and say, of course it's that the Russians attacked Germany in World War II, they were trying to invade from Moscow to Berlin or something like that.
And the same with Hungary, Croatia, Finland, all the countries that took part in the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, each of them in fact invaded by the Soviets. Of course, the other way around. The world turned upside down.
The other way around. Reality can never ruin your speech. This is something politicians know very well. And what for? Well, this lady, and mind you, this has been leaked many times already, has a lot of complaints from the, let's say, diplomatic corps of the European Union she leads. And they say she's a disgrace, that besides being senselessly Russophobic, she's incompetent and extremely sectarian. Well, these are the people who lead us. So that's what we've got. But anyway, this is important because things are moving very quickly, just like the taking of positions, since it's final.
Igual que la toma de Bolshansk, ya que es definitiva. Quiere decir, ya sabes que siempre hay un periodo en el que si...
That is, you know, there's always a period when if the Russian Ministry of Defense says it's been taken, then maybe not, then maybe yes. And that's normal, because it's very hard to determine. Look, we've reached this street, but no. It turns out this street changes hands 3 times a day. So, well, but yes, the administrative boundaries of what is Bolchan, let's say the city itself, those have already been taken. And what's more important, once that's taken, the Russians are slowly advancing through the towns, the small villages and hamlets around Bolchan. That is to say, the issue of Bolchan has already been resolved. It's been conquered. From now on, these small advances will keep growing, and we'll see it throughout this month of December. They'll keep growing, and watch out, because this is another big problem for the Ukrainians, who will inevitably have to send forces there to try to contain that advance. In other words, the big city that had been, for 17 or 19 months, I can't even remember, an absurd amount of time, the Ukrainians' line of defense, meaning the place where they had stopped the Russians, that's over.
Fernando, to avoid going over the entire front, I wanted your take on a major Russian advance from the day before yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. Here, 2 days ago, toward Klinove. And this deep penetration has already been confirmed. Quite deep. What do you think the objective is? Because it could open an attack front toward the last major defensive block in Ukraine, along the Konstantinivka-Kramatorsk axis, and farther north, Sloviansk, a bit higher up. They're making a very rapid push here into an area that until now was thought to be the last of the last within the Russian strategy in this region, aren't they?
Let's see, it's like everything else. I mean, the Russians are taking advantage of a weakness in a specific sector of the Ukrainians, logically. And it was much debated at the beginning, whether they had taken it, whether they hadn't, and so on. Well, it seems they have taken it, but we'll see this from the moment we already know that Pokrovsk is more than taken, and that Minograd has very little left. Right now, Minograd might still hold about half of the northern part, more or less. That is to say, to the point that the Russians are already halfway to conquering Kirchner. I mean, they had already half surrounded it, entered the first streets, but now they've pushed in deeper.
1,500 soldiers trapped here, according to this report. 1,500 soldiers completely encircled at this point, plus all those who have already surrendered or been killed, right?
Yes, and also you can see it there, how they're being hit with a FAP 500. In one of these, I mean, that's coming down on them. Look, it's tremendous. They're really getting hit hard. This is already settled, meaning the Russians are taking it easy. What's left is nothing. Even the Ukrainians themselves are already thinking about other things, because right now their problem is no longer Minograd, which is lost. That is, the problem they have is that the Russians have advanced into Kirchner, and from now on, once they take Minograd, Kirchner will be next, and it won't take them long. The thing is, they're freeing up a lot of troops that will go to the Zaporizhia front, Dnipropetrovsk and others, almost certainly heading north, but north from behind. That is, and there they have a problem because they don't have enough forces. That is, toward the southern front, Zaporizhia, and where to, Fernando? Northward, that is, toward what they tried, and then the Ukrainians stopped. That advanced northward to take Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the rear, that is, from the west. This will obviously take time, because it's not easy. But of course, we're dealing with the same old situation. For example, there's been a major counterattack recently. Well, not just now, it's been going on for a few days. A major Ukrainian counterattack in Kupiansk. They've regained some areas, some nearby towns, but we've seen this before. I mean, counterattacks that ultimately exhaust your forces. And in the end, the Russians later on end up retaking what you had captured. You've wasted your forces, and it hasn't done you any good. This is a sign of weakness. Yes, you can still carry out counterattacks, not offensives or counteroffensives. That's already unthinkable. You can launch counterattacks in specific sectors, but in the end, you no longer have the capacity to hold them or keep control of anything. Well, as I said, this takes a toll. I mean, if I have to concentrate troops to try to retake part of Kupiansk, or to stop them from advancing further and so on, since I don't have any left, I have to pull them from somewhere else. And that's causing a lot of criticism, with people saying, hey, either you get serious about the Zaporizhia issue, or we'll lose it. In other words, this is no joke. Stop copying what others are doing elsewhere, because this is really serious. And, well, that's why, as we said at the beginning of the program, the issue of women comes up. There aren't enough personnel. And that's why people are saying, whatever, let's give them the F-16, the Mirage 2000, whatever you want. But if there aren't enough people, it doesn't matter what you give them, because you don't have the manpower to break through or to exploit the tactical successes you achieve at any given moment.
Before we wrap up, Fernando, since in 10 minutes, DMP Geopolitics, our sister channel, will start airing Eduardo Bior's program about Japan and China. Very interesting, really fascinating. A little bit about Trump's latest statements regarding the possibility of ground attacks against Venezuela, and even against other European countries, apparently referring to Colombia, something like that. These are the statements from Mr. Orange.
A reporter.
Un reportero. Quería aclarar algo que usted dijo el domingo sobre los impactos de barcos cerca.
I wanted to clarify something you said on Sunday about the ship impacts near Venezuela. You said you didn't know whether the second impact... 1 second, Fernando. Because the video playback generated 4 videos at once. I was hearing 4 different things. Alright, now, as the Americans would say, now we're good. Okay, once again, the reporter. I wanted to clarify something you said on Sunday about the ship impacts near Venezuela. You said you didn't know whether the second impact on that ship had occurred, but that you wouldn't have wished for it, now that your administration has acknowledged it. Do you support that second impact? And Mr. Secretary, I wanted you to clarify something. You said in the September interview on Fox News that you had seen that impact live, on television, in real time.
En vivo, que había visto ese impacto en vivo por televisión en tiempo real. Sabía que hubo sobrevivientes después del primer impacto.
I knew there were survivors after the... Well, this question refers to a video in which a ship is first attacked with a missile, and then, once the ship is destroyed and people are floating in the water crying for help, they are finished off with another missile strike, killing all the occupants. That ship, without any proof whatsoever, and even with proof, they couldn't commit a crime of that nature, caused a huge stir, even more so after the back and forth from the United States. Yes, no, that they had authorized the attack, then that they hadn't, that it had actually been an act of insubordination. The Secretary of War boasted about it. We finished them off because I ordered it. Yes, that's what he bragged about. Later, Trump partially corrected it.
Fanfarroneó, después Trump rectificó en parte. Bueno, ahora la respuesta de Trump.
Well, now Trump's response here saying the following. Well, look, all this, for every ship you see explode, we save an average of 25,000 lives. 25,000 lives. They've been sending enough horrible fentanyl and other substances like cocaine, but fentanyl, right now, is the most common, capable of killing our entire nation. Because a tiny particle, the size of a pinhead, can kill someone. It's a very dangerous substance.
Es una sustancia muy peligrosa. Conozco a mucha gente cuyos hijos eran drogadictos, tomaron una pequeña...
I know many people whose children were drug addicts. They took a small sample and died. They died. They couldn't believe it. I want to pause here, Fernando. All of this, but lie after lie, stupidity after stupidity. First, all the fentanyl consumed in the United States is produced in the United States. Transportation makes no sense, same as with methamphetamines. Anyone with even a little bit of knowledge about drug production knows this. What they wanted, what the Americans kept hammering on about at the time, was the arrival of Chinese substances, Chinese components, Chinese precursors for the production of fentanyl in the United States. If someone wanted to generate the export of fentanyl, moreover illegally, that would be an unfeasible business because of the cost of fentanyl. So, in any case, the countries export chemical substances to the United States, and there the drug producers manufacture fentanyl and sell it there. Venezuela lacks those chemical substances and, much less, engages in the export or trafficking of fentanyl. It's complete nonsense. Besides, that stupid 1980s discourse of, just a tiny bit of drugs will kill you. No, 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 no. A total disaster. A total disaster. The drug problem doesn't stem from supply, but from demand. A broken society like the United States, constantly demanding drugs. Addictions don't come from the substances themselves, but from the vulnerability of the addicted individuals. Well, all of that is denied in this nonsense. And sorry for this anger, but no, it's just the truth.
No, es que es verdad. Pero a ti lo que hay es la parte de la ignorancia,
But what we have here is that ignorance is evident all over the world. I can make up a story here that, as you rightly point out, is absolutely implausible, but who cares? I mean, who cares? The problem we have with the United States and with this administration, well, with the United States in general, is that they don't even bother to lie with a certain, let's say, plausibility anymore. No, who cares? It's as if they said fentanyl is produced on Mars. They don't care. They could say that too. They couldn't care less. Because what they want is to attack Venezuela, or rather to get their hands on Venezuela's oil. They don't know how. And if it weren't fentanyl, then it would be, I don't know, that they're parsley producers. And it turns out parsley kills. A lie, but who cares?
That is to say, well, that's where we are. As for this particular attack, I still haven't gotten much information because I depend on Pete. But to me, it was an attack. No, it was 2 attacks, 3 attacks. Someone asked me about the second attack. I didn't know anything about the second attack. Didn't know anything about the people. I wasn't involved. I knew they took him on a ship. But I'll say this, they had an attack. I've heard that the gentleman in charge is extraordinary, an extraordinary person. I'll let Pete talk to him, but Pete was satisfied. Pete didn't know that the second attack would involve 2 people, and I suppose he'll have to talk about that. I can say this, I want those ships dismantled, and if necessary, we'll also attack by land, just as we attacked by sea. And there's very little coming in by sea. I think we've dismantled more than 90%. There's still very little left, and I get it, there's very little. We're saving hundreds of thousands of lives with these targeted strikes. It's amazing to see a boat moving forward. And a lot of the press would like to say they're not. Do you see the boat? Maybe it's not drugs? Do you see those boats, first of all? They've got 5 engines on the back, a boat going in strange directions, and loaded with lots of white containers. They're bags full of stuff. No, they've done an incredible job. And Pete too. Pete, you could probably answer the question better than I could. Well, and that's where Pete starts. I think in the end, those bad detective shows from the 80s, but sadly with real dead people. That's the terrible part, isn't it?
Sure, but notice that, the Secretary of War, Peter Hess, really messed things up. Because not only did he do something outrageous, but he also bragged about it. So he shows up there, they ask him backstage, and he says, let this guy deal with the mess. A disaster. Like, no, I don't know anything about this. Let the Secretary of War tell it. He's the one who caused the mess. And I think in the end, this Pete guy, this disgraceful one, ended up blaming a subordinate who had nothing to do with it. But anyway, what does it matter? Just getting the problem off his back, right? Saying, oh, come on, I don't know anything. Me, says Trump, no. For me, there are times when they say, no, Pete and so are handling that here. He hasn't really told me much about it. Oh, 2 more of those guys out there have died. No, let Pete tell it, I don't know anything. In other words, passing the blame to someone else. And that person trying to get out of the mess. Well, it's ridiculous. It's pathetic. But we're already used to this. They just don't care about anything. Like I said, the problem now is that, fine, going around destroying boats and killing various fishermen and things like that, you can't present that as a success. Even if they say, no, we've eliminated 90% of sea trafficking. Since there's no sea traffic, of course, everything's been wiped out, there's nothing left. Well, okay, now the land forces are coming and all that, but we all know that, even, can't remember now, I've heard deputies, U.S. congressmen saying clearly, yes, the drug issue and all that is terrible, but what we're really interested in is the oil. They say it openly, right? So, well, okay, and now what? Because you can't present this as a success. That we've destroyed about 20 barges and killed, I don't know, 200 people. And after deploying half of the U.S. fleet here and spending an enormous amount of money, because deploying half a fleet costs a fortune, you present this as a success? Well, no, you can't present this as a success. So now what are we going to do? Well, not us, but Travi and company. Are you going to invade? No, because they know they'd lose. Are you going to bomb and create chaos? It seems they haven't managed to bribe any general to betray Maduro or anything like that. So what are they going to do? Because this is a failure, no matter how much you try to spin it. And that's the danger. What are they going to do now?
Exactly. The big moment, Fernando. The big moment will be next Friday, precisely with talk number 300, the 300th talk, happening on a Friday with Juan Antonio. We'll definitely do something special then. Among other things, we'll present some spectacular covers designed once again by our friend Jesus Gil, like that time when our images were drawn as comic book or anime covers, something along those lines. Fernando, if you feel like it, drop by that day. You're more than welcome, of course.
Well, I have Friday at 11, meaning 11 p.m. So it can be connected, of course.
We could do that, right? Something like that. Yeah.
What time do you all finish?
Yes, always a little earlier, about an hour and a half usually. So around 10:30, 11, we could do something. Well, we'll deliberate later. We'll think of something or other. This Friday, episode number 300. So everyone's invited. More and more shows, Fernando. At any moment, we'll have one of our own.
Exactly. Let's see, for episode 300, which will be a special one, I expect at least 30,000 people watching us. Anything less? 30,000? No. Me like Trump. I mean, let's not hold back on exaggerating. But come on, at least more than 3,000. 4,000. We have to reach 4,000.
Yes, 4,000. That we can. He's going to show exclusive images of Madrid's wildlife, after the images of Madrid's trash, the animals in the streets of Madrid. And we're not talking about politicians. No, really, actual animals in the streets of Madrid. Dear Fernando, a hug. Eduardo has already started, so let's wrap it up. Hugs, my friend.
Likewise, see you later.
Yeah.